So, new study out that models the Liberal climate plan and its ability to reach the Canada's climate targets by 2030. So, I'm going to talk to economist Michael Bernstein from Canadians for Clean Prosperity about that. So, welcome to the interview, Michael.
Thanks, Markham.
So, in a nutshell, under the Liberals, the Liberal plan anyway, is Canada going to get to where it needs to be by 2030?
Well, the plan itself, we find, has a reasonable chance, though certainly no guarantee, but a reasonable chance of getting to the proposed targets for 2030. Specifically, we find that there's a reduction of between 37 and 41% by 2030. And the difference in that range really is driven by what oil prices, and thus oil production, oil and gas production, really, I should say, will do over the next 8 years. But yes, the Liberals have a reasonable chance, but of course that's the plan. And the key really now is they've got to put that plan into action.
Well, let's talk about oil and gas because the Prime Minister, the Liberal leader then during the campaign, Justin Trudeau, promised to cap oil and gas emissions almost immediately and begin bringing them down in a systematic fashion beginning in the next year or two. How did that play into your modeling?
So we looked at two scenarios for oil and gas production. One where we have relatively high prices, similar to today, frankly, and another one where we have much more modest oil and gas prices. Both of those scenarios were based on the Canada Energy Regulator scenarios. They have a high and kind of a more medium term or medium range, I should say, price forecast. And that does make a pretty big difference. So under the high price scenario, for example, where you see oil prices in 2030 in that $75 range, what we find is that oil production and gas production grow between now and 2030. But the key is that even while it is growing, emissions still do decline, and that's due to this cap on emissions that the Liberals have proposed to put in place, which results in massive electrification across the oil and gas extraction processes, something that is much easier to model than to put into practice, but we do see in the results that it's certainly possible.
Now that raises the question of where that electricity is going to come from, because Alberta still has a fair amount of coal in its electricity system. How did you handle that in the modeling?
Yeah, it's a great point. And another thing that's happening in the model based on the Liberal climate plans is this announcement of a clean electricity standard, which is mandating fully net zero electricity by 2035. So even as we're electrifying oil and gas, there's also a significant moves to clean up, so to speak, the electricity grid. So coal is phased out in the next couple of years, as I think is likely to happen anyway in the absence of new policy. And what we're seeing is very, very significant deployment of wind in particular, and solar as well, but especially wind, paired with battery storage. And so that's making up a lot of the new generation capacity.
What about transportation? That's a big source of emissions in Canada. How did you model that?
Yeah, so the Liberals have a series of policies that are aimed at reducing emissions. The most notable ones are things like the 50% zero emission vehicle standard by 2030. In other words, saying that half of all light duty vehicles will have to be zero emitting by 2030. And that gets you some real emissions reductions. But interestingly, one of the things that we find in the report is it's actually non-passenger vehicles, things like heavy duty vehicles, certainly, but also things like garbage trucks and winter service vehicles and mining vehicles that end up being really, really important parts of the emission reduction story. And we see those categories actually generating more emissions reductions than in the light duty vehicles. And one of the reasons for that is actually because technology is moving quite quickly on the light duty vehicle side. So the policies make less of an incremental difference than they do with these other vehicle categories.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a fair amount of activity already in transit authorities for replacing diesel buses with electric buses, that sort of thing.
Yeah, diesel, that's exactly right. And diesel, switching from diesel is one of the biggest emissions reductions opportunities within transport. And it's something we're going to have to focus on a lot over the coming years, partially because it's going to be important what one switches from diesel to. So one thing the model does actually, in the absence of new policy, is switch a lot of those heavy duty vehicles to natural gas, which does get you emissions reductions for 2030, but it's not consistent with a net zero pathway for 2050. And I think is actually a really good illustration of some of the trade-offs we're going to face here in Canada over the next few years, and how we're going to need to design policy to optimize for the long term and not just for those within this decade kinds of reductions.
Now, one of your recommendations really caught my eye, and that's switch to full industrial carbon pricing. Now, am I correct to assume that you'll be getting rid of the output-based allocation system where, companies that face competition from outside the country will no longer get the 80 to 90% discount they do under the current system?
Yeah, that is correct. And that is one of our key recommendations. And one of the reasons for that is when we look to 2050, what we see is 3/4 of the emissions remaining in the economy are from heavy industry and transport. And a lot of those transport vehicles are to serve industry. So when we look at that and say, how are we going to get the deeper emissions reductions in industry that we're going to need to hit net zero, the most cost-effective way to do that is through the carbon pricing mechanism. And moreover, so that's the main reason we make that recommendations for the emissions reduction potential. But I would also point out that another benefit of moving to a full price and away from the output-based systems that you referred to is that it's going to enable Canada to rebate the domestic carbon price on exports as part of the border carbon adjustment. And given that we are such an export dependent economy, I think that is going to be a really important factor going forward as we design some sort of border carbon adjustment.
Now, industry has been, the oil and gas industry would be an example that lobbied the government hard on this issue and wanted high discounts. Do you think that they will, I would guess they do the same thing again, and is it politically feasible, do you think, to either get rid of it or make significant reductions?
It's going to be a challenge for sure. And I expect all of this to play out over a long period of time. I think this might take the whole decade before we truly have a transition system, and perhaps even longer, frankly, if you look at the example from Europe. But ultimately, this is about how are we going to get the kind of reductions we're going to need to get to net zero in a way that's cost effective for the economy. Of course, those revenues, though, can be used to support industry. And I think you're seeing that ultimately we are going to need a package of policies that balances various objectives, reducing emissions, providing economic support, maintaining jobs. So it's going to be a complex road ahead, but really there's no time to waste in getting started.
Well, to wrap up the interview, Michael, how much risk is there that Canada is not going to make these targets and fall badly in terms of implementing some of these policies, or, the old Canadian compromise, muddle through approach instead of being firm and proceeding in a firm fashion? What are the odds?
Yeah, there's significant risk for sure. And I think what it's really going to hinge on is, can we move quickly to get in place some of the regulations that are going to be key pillars of the decarbonization effort over the next 8 years? Because the private sector needs some time to understand what the policies are going to be when they're actually legislated or when they're officially adopted, and then to make the kinds of investments to transition to lower carbon alternatives. So there really is no time to waste. It's by no means a certainty that we'll achieve the targets. But the good news is at least we have the first step that's required, which is a plan that can get us there. That's essential. But it's of course in no way sufficient. We've got a lot of work ahead to implement these policies, not to mention all the challenges dealing with different kinds of jurisdictional issues, working with provinces, working with Indigenous groups. So there's a front road ahead but at least the potential to meet our targets is there.
Michael, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Always good to talk to you, Markham.